This unit is where economics stops feeling irrelevant and starts explaining things you see every day. Prices don't just exist, they respond to people's choices. For example, when demand goes up, prices tend to rise, and when supply increases, prices tend to fall. In this video, we're going to start with probably the most famous graph in all of economics, the supply and demand curve. Today is where you finally start to feel like an economist. Alright, let's start with supply and demand. We have a lot to cover for this unit, so I suggest taking notes just to keep things a bit more organized. Okay, in economics, demand isn't just wanting something. Demand means the willingness and ability to buy at different prices. On this graph here, price is on the vertical axis while quantity is on the horizontal axis, and the demand curve slopes downward. Why, you may ask? Well, there are three main reasons. First is going to be the substitution effect. When the price of something goes up, people look for alternatives. If one option gets more expensive, substitutes start to feel a lot better. Like Coke and Pepsi. If the price of a can of Coke jumps up to $10 per can, then more people will rush to buy Pepsi. However, very few true Coke enthusiasts may still pay that $10 per can. Second is the income effect. When prices rise, your purchasing power falls. Think about it. If you only have $20 to spend, but the price of your morning coffee increases, you can't buy the same amount of coffee. Even if your income doesn't change, things can feel much more expensive. Lastly is diminishing marginal utility, and this one's very important. As you consume more of a good, each additional unit gives you less satisfaction than the one before. Imagine you're very thirsty in the middle of the night. You drink a cup of water and the satisfaction is at peak. But when you take another cup of water, it's not as good. Eventually, you get super full and you hate the thought of drinking another cup. That's your satisfaction getting less and less. Now let's talk about shifts. A good way to remember this is the acronym TIMER. T stands for taste and preferences, I stands for income, M stands for market size and number of buyers, E stands for expectations about the future, and R stands for related goods prices, like substitutes or complements. So demand is really about behavior. It shows how consumers respond to prices, income, and preferences, and how much satisfaction they get from each additional unit. Okay, before we move on, there's something I need to clear. This is where a lot of students make mistakes. A lot of students tend to mix up change in quantity demanded and change in demand. First is moving along the demand curve. This is what we call a change in quantity demanded. And this happens for just one reason: price changes. When prices fall, quantity demanded increases. When prices rise, quantity demanded decreases. Nothing else changed. Preferences didn't change, income didn't change. It's just the same demand curve. You're just moving from one point to another on the same curve. Now look on the right. This is completely different. This is a shift of the entire demand curve, and we call this a change in demand. Here, price is not the cause. Something else changed, and it's one of the non-price factors, which is going to be your timer. When demand increases, the entire curve shifts right. At every price, consumers now want more. When demand decreases, the entire curve shifts left. At every price, consumers want less. On the exam, using the wrong phrase, quantity demanded or demand, can cost you a point. So make sure you take note of this. Alright, I'm going to quickly move through supply because conceptually it mirrors demand. Just switch your perspective. Demand was about buyers, now we're talking about sellers. Okay, supply means the willingness and ability to sell a good or service at different prices. The supply curve slopes upward, and the law of supply says this: as the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied increases. As the price falls, the quantity supplied decreases. So why does this work? Well, it's because of three main reasons. First is profit motive. Higher prices means higher potential profit, so firms want to produce more. Second is increasing marginal cost. To produce more, firms must use less efficient resources, which raises costs over time. And third is incentives. Higher prices attract more production effort and sometimes more sellers. Now, just like demand, we have an acronym to memorize the different shifts. This time, it's rotten. R stands for resource costs, O is other goods prices, T is technology, T again is taxes and subsidies, E is expectation of future prices, N is the number of sellers. If any of these change, the entire supply curve shifts. Now, just like demand, the same rules apply to supply. Change in quantity supplied or price is movement along the curve, while a change in supply or non-price factors is the entire curve shifting. This is your rotten. Okay, it's our first quiz time. Take a second and read this question. Now let's slow this down and separate price effects from non-price effects. The first thing that happens is the price of electric scooters increases. Anytime price changes, that affects quantity demanded, not demand. Higher price means a decrease in quantity demanded, so that's movement along the demand curve. At the same time, something else happens. A study increases consumers' preferences for scooters. Preference is a non-price determinant. That means the demand curve itself increases, so the entire demand curve shifts right. Both are happening at once. One causes a movement along the curve, while the other causes a shift of the curve. That combination is exactly why the correct answer is C, a decrease in quantity demanded and a rightward shift of demand. Now let's move on to market equilibrium. Doesn't it sound cool? Okay, the equilibrium point is where both curves intersect. At equilibrium, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and there's no pressure for a price to change. Buyers are satisfied and sellers are also satisfied. That price is the equilibrium price, and that quantity is the equilibrium quantity. Anytime the market is not at equilibrium, we call it disequilibrium. Disequilibrium just means the quantity demanded does not meet the quantity supplied. And there are only two possibilities. First is price is set above the equilibrium. And this could happen due to many different reasons, which we'll cover later on. When prices are too high, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and that creates a surplus. Sellers have excess goods sitting unsold, so they lower prices to try to get rid of them. As prices fall, the market moves back toward the equilibrium. Second, price is below the equilibrium. When price is too low, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and that creates a shortage. Buyers try to compete with each other, and sellers respond by raising prices. As price rises, the market again moves back toward the equilibrium. Now let's talk about what actually changes the equilibrium. A change in equilibrium happens only when demand or supply shifts, not price changes or movement along the curve. That shift creates a temporary surplus or shortage, which pushes price or quantity to a new equilibrium. And there's actually only 4 cases. But I suggest not memorizing this, but instead thinking through what actually happens when demand or supply shifts. For example, a decrease in demand means fewer people want to get a good at every price. As a result, firms are left with extra inventory or a surplus, and to get rid of the surplus, producers lower the price, which encourages more consumers to buy. And as price falls, the quantity exchanged in the market also falls, leading to a lower equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity. And the same logic applies to all 4 cases. If you focus on who has the excess, you can always predict how price and quantity adjust, even without memorization. Now, I hope you've gotten single shifts down, because this next part might be a little bit tricky. Let's talk about double shifts. In a single shift, price and quantity are both determined, but when demand and supply shift at the same time, they can push price or quantity in opposite directions. We often say one outcome is indeterminate. Indeterminate just means that one variable is certain and the other depends on which shift is stronger. Here's a graph you can look at to show the different possible outcomes, but I don't suggest you memorize them. Instead, play with pens or even your fingers to determine which variable is indeterminate. Here's an example of one variable being indeterminate. When demand increases and supply decreases, what's going to happen? Well, in both cases, the pink dot obviously moved upward, so price must be determined. But quantity either decreased or increased. So in a case where demand increases and supply decreases, the price moves up and the quantity is indeterminate and depends on which curve shifts more. Now it's time for our second quiz this video. Take a second and read this question. Let's break this down step by step. Well, we know that an increase in consumers' preferences will shift the demand curve right because of timer. And government regulations that increase the cost of producing avocados is a tax which decreases supply. So we know this is a double shift where demand increases and supply decreases. With this knowledge, we know that one of the outcomes must be indeterminate. So the answer is obviously E. Okay, but what if on the AP test, there is more than one answer that says the outcome is indeterminate? This is where we use two pens or two of your fingers to determine what happens. Put your pens in a cross, just like supply and demand graph, and move the demand curve to the right and supply curve to the left. In this case, the equilibrium point shoots up while you're not so sure about the quantity. In this case, the equilibrium price increased and the quantity is indeterminate. Imagine your favorite snack doubles in price. Would you buy less, switch brands, or keep buying the same thing anyway? That reaction is elasticity. Up till now, supply and demand helped us understand prices and quantity going up and down. But that's only half of the story. Because here's the next question economists care about. How much does quantity respond when price changes? That's exactly where elasticity comes in. Elasticity is really just a measure of price sensitivity. It tells us how responsive buyers and sellers are to changes in price, income, or the prices of related goods. Some goods are very sensitive to price changes. If the price goes up just a little, people buy a lot less. Other goods barely change at all. Prices move, but people keep buying roughly the same amount. In AP Economics, we break elasticity into four main types: price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, cross-price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand. Let's first talk about the most important one: price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand, or PED, measures how sensitive buyers are to a change in price. When price changes, do consumers react a lot or just a little? To calculate it, we have this formula: percent change in quantities demanded over percent change in price. And remember, percent change is always calculated as new minus old divided by old multiplied by 100. Let's walk through a quick example. Suppose the price of a good increases from 100 to 110, and at the same exact time, quantity demanded falls from 100 units down to 80 units. The percent change in quantity demanded is negative 20%, and the percent change in price is positive 10%. Now here's a huge calculation rule. Ignore the negative sign. Demand curve slopes downward, so price elasticity will almost always come out negative. For price elasticity of demand, we care about the absolute value. So we compare 20% to 10%. Quantity changes more than price, which tells us demand is elastic. And that brings us to our 5 types of elasticity you need to know. If elasticity is greater than 1, demand is elastic. If it equals to 1, demand is unit elastic. If it's less than 1, demand is inelastic. At extremes, perfectly elastic demand has elasticity of infinity, and perfectly inelastic demand has an elasticity of 0. One last thing to remember as we move forward. The slope of the demand curve reflects elasticity. Flatter curves are more elastic, and steeper curves are more inelastic. Now let's connect elasticity to graphs, because this is where most students get confused and it comes up on the test. There are 3 main cases you need to recognize visually: elastic, inelastic, and unit elastic demand. First, take a look at elastic demand. Here, a small change in price leads to a large change in quantities demanded. On the graph, that means the curve looks relatively flat. Price moves from P1 to P2, but quantity jumps a lot from Q1 to Q2. Next, look at inelastic demand. In this case, price changes a lot, but quantity barely responds. The curve looks more steep. So even when price falls from P1 to P2, quantity only increases a little. So here, price change is larger than quantity change, which tells us demand is inelastic, elasticity less than 1. Now look at unit elastic demand. This is the middle case. The percent change in price is exactly equal to the percent change in quantity demanded. On this graph, the price change and quantity change look proportional. That's why elasticity equals to 1. Now let's finish off the 5 graphs with the 2 extreme cases. First is perfectly elastic demand. And this one is easy because the demand curve is horizontal. And this tells us that consumers are extremely price sensitive. At one specific price, buyers are willing to purchase at any quantity. But the moment the price changes just a little, quantity demanded drops to 0. The classic example of this is in a perfectly competitive market where all products are identical. So if one seller raises the price, consumers instantly switch to another seller. Now look at the perfectly inelastic demand. Here, the demand curve is vertical. That means consumers buy the same quantity no matter what the price is. Even if the price rises or falls, quantity demanded stays exactly the same. So in this case, price changes but quantity doesn't. And this usually applies to necessities with no close substitutes, like life-saving medicine or insulin. Now let's look at total revenue versus price versus elasticity. First, know this formula. Total revenue, or TR, is just price times quantity. So anytime price changes, total revenue depends on how much quantity responds. And that's where elasticity comes in. And look at the demand curve on the right. The top portion is elastic, the middle point is unit elastic, and the bottom portion is inelastic. When demand is elastic, consumers are very responsive to price. So when price goes up, quantity demanded falls by a lot, and total revenue actually goes down. But if price goes down in the elastic range, quantity increases by a lot, so total revenue goes up. Now look at the unit elastic point. This is the turning point for total revenue. At unit elastic demand, the marginal revenue curve hits 0, and total revenue is maximized. That's a huge rule. TR is maximized when MR equals 0, which happens at unit elasticity. And finally, look at the inelastic range. Here, consumers are not very responsive to price changes. So when price goes up, quantity only falls by a little, and total revenue increases. But if price goes down in the inelastic range, total revenue falls. Price elasticity of supply is quite similar to demand. It measures how much quantity supplied responds to a change in price. And the rules here are basically the same as price elasticity of demand. So don't overthink it. If price changes a lot, but quantity supplied barely changes, supply is inelastic. If a small price change leads to a big change in quantity supplied, supply is elastic. If price and quantity change by the same percentage, that's unit elastic. A horizontal supply curve means perfectly elastic, and a vertical supply curve means perfectly inelastic. To summarize, the main idea is elasticity depends on how responsive producers are, not on whether supply slopes up or down. Now let's move on to cross-price elasticity of demand. The simple definition here is that it measures how the quantity demanded of one good responds when the price of a different good, like a complement or substitute, changes. And here's a formula we use to calculate it. If the value is positive, the two goods are substitutes. When the price of one goes up, people buy more of the other. Think of coffee and tea. And if the value is negative, the two goods are complements, and they're usually used together. When the price of one goes up, demand for the other falls, like printers and ink. If the value is 0, the goods are unrelated. A price change in one has no effect on the other. Moving on to income elasticity of demand, it's quite similar to CPED. It measures how quantity demanded changes when consumer income changes. And here's the formula we use. If the value is positive, this good is a normal good, meaning a more expensive good or a luxury good. When people earn more income, they buy more of it, and most goods fall into this category. But if the value is negative, the good is an inferior good. So if a normal good is a piece of steak, then an inferior good would be a 30-cent cup noodle. As income rises, people buy less of it because they switch to better alternatives. And if the value is zero, demand doesn't really change with income. And here's a quick tip. This is one of the most common behaviors. When people get more money, they often look for something better or like an alternative. Before we move on, this is really important. For PED and PES, the answer you calculate can be negative, and that's normal. For PED and PES, ignore the sign and focus on the absolute value. What matters here is how responsive quantity is to price changes, not the direction. So for PED and PES, look at the magnitude and not direction. But for CPED and YED, it's the opposite. Here, the sign matters a lot. Positive or negative tells you the relationship between goods. Positive means substitute or normal goods, and negative means complement or inferior goods. Finally, it's quiz time again. Take a second and read this question. Okay, let's go through this. The price of good X increases and quantity demanded falls. And that part alone doesn't tell us anything yet about elasticity. What matters here is total revenue. And we're told when price goes up, total revenue increases. And that only happens when demand is price inelastic. Why? When demand is inelastic, consumers are not very sensitive to price changes. So even though fewer units are sold, the higher price more than offsets its drop in quantity. And that's exactly what's happening here. So the correct conclusion is that demand for good X is price inelastic over this price range. So that's why the correct answer is B. Okay, now let's move on to the next topic, which is price control, deadweight loss, tax, and trade and tariffs. From now on, understanding these graphs is critical. So pay attention and take some notes. Okay, now let's talk about surplus, which is really just the way economists measure how much people benefit from a market. Let's start with consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So think about it like this. Let's say I expect to pay $5 for something, but the market price is only $3, and I still buy it. And that extra $2 I didn't have to pay becomes my consumer surplus. I valued it at 5, I paid 3, so my surplus is 2. But now let's take a look at producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the price producers receive and the minimum price they're willing to sell for. So imagine a producer is willing to sell a product for at least $2, but the market price is $3. That extra $1 they earn above their minimum acceptable price is producer surplus. And when a market is at equilibrium, both of these exist at the same time. Buyers are paying less than they're willing to pay, and sellers are receiving more than they're willing to accept. If we add consumer surplus and producer surplus together, we get total surplus. Total surplus represents the total gains from a trade in a market. It shows how much benefit society gets overall from buyers and sellers interacting. On the graph, total surplus is the entire area between demand curve and the supply curve, up to the equilibrium quantity. This is why equilibrium is so important. At equilibrium, total surplus is maximized, meaning resources are being allocated in the most efficient way. When prices are free to adjust, markets naturally move toward outcomes where total surplus is as large as possible. And this idea of surplus is exactly what we'll use next to understand how government policies like price ceilings, price floors, taxes, and tariffs affect markets and sometimes reduce that total surplus through deadweight loss. Now let's move on to price ceilings and price floors. A price ceiling is the government saying you're not allowed to charge more than this. It's set below the equilibrium, so it actually matters. This is usually for essential goods like rent or food. The price looks great for buyers, but now everyone wants to buy it, and producers don't want to sell as much, and that creates a shortage. There's not enough goods to go around, fewer trades happen, and some people who are willing to buy and sell just can't. And that loss is what we call deadweight loss. A price floor is the opposite. The government says you can't charge less than this, and is set above the equilibrium to protect producers, like minimum wage or farm prices. Producers are happy to sell more at a higher price, but consumers don't want to buy as much. So we get a surplus. Extra goods sit unsold, fewer trades happen, and again, those missed trades turn into deadweight loss. Now let's dive deeper into deadweight loss. The simple definition here is the loss of total surplus that occurs when market outcome is not efficient, causing some mutually beneficial trades to not take place. And the main causes of this is usually price ceilings, price floors, taxes, imperfect markets, and externalities. But how do we even find the area of deadweight loss? Well, first, find the efficient quantity, which is just the equilibrium quantity. Then, identify what quantity traded reduced to. Then, compare efficient quantity and the actual quantity traded. That triangle between the demand and supply curve lies between QA and QE, and this is the total loss of surplus, which is your deadweight loss. Okay, now let's take a look at what an excise tax does to a market. When the government adds a tax, the supply curve shifts outward because selling the good now costs more. That's why you see a new curve labeled S plus tax. Because of tax, the market no longer meets at the original equilibrium. Price goes up for buyers, price received by sellers go down, and quantity traded falls to QT. And that drop in quantity is important. Firstly, consumer surplus shrinks. Buyers are either paying a higher price or buying fewer units. Secondly, producer surplus shrinks. Sellers receive less per unit and sell fewer units. But not all of that lost surplus disappears. That yellow triangle in the middle is tax revenue. That's the money the government collects from the tax. However, there is still a loss left over, which means there's deadweight loss involved. Now let's talk about tax incidence, which is really just a way of asking who actually pays the tax. Is it the consumers or is it the producers? And the idea here is simple. It depends on elasticity, not on who the government says the tax is imposed on. Look at the graph here. Here, demand is inelastic. Consumers really need this good. Think about things like gasoline, cigarettes, or even basic medicine. And when a tax is added, the price consumers pay go up a lot, and the price producers receive go down only a little. That means consumers bear most of the tax burden. They don't reduce their quantity by much, but they end up paying more of the tax. Now, look at the graph on the right. Here, demand is elastic. Consumers have many alternatives, like luxury brands, fancy coffee, or designer clothes. When the tax is added, consumers are very responsive. They cut back on a lot if the price rises. So producers can't pass much of the tax onto consumers. Instead, producers bear most of the tax burden by receiving a much lower price. Okay, it's quiz time. Take your time and fill these questions out. Okay, let's go through this together step by step. Before the tax, the market is at equilibrium, and the equilibrium price is 7, and the equilibrium quantity is 40. And at this point, total surplus is maximized, meaning the market is efficient and there's no deadweight loss. And consumer surplus is the triangle above the price and below the demand, which comes out to be 140. And producer surplus is the triangle below the price and above the supply, which is 100. And everything here right now is working perfectly. Now, let's see what happens after the tax. Once the tax is imposed, the supply curve shifts up, and the new equilibrium changes. Buyers now have to pay a price of 9, but sellers only receive 5. That gap between 9 and 5, that $4 difference, is the tax per unit. And because of the higher price and lower quantity traded, the new quantity falls from 40 all the way down to 30. Consumer surplus shrinks to 75, and producer surplus also shrinks down to 45. The government collects tax revenue equals to tax per unit multiplied by quantity traded, which is just 4 times 30, which is 120 in tax revenue. But something important is happening here. Even though the government collects revenue, some surplus disappears entirely, and that red triangle on the graph is our deadweight loss, and its value is 20. Now, let's answer the big question. Who paid more of the tax? Well, the buyers paid $2 more per unit across 30 units, so that's $60. And the sellers received $2 less per unit across 30 units, so that's also $60. So the tax burden is split evenly between consumers and producers in this case. Okay, by now, I'm sure you've heard of the phrase tariff wars or tariff before. Countries are raising taxes on imports, and other countries are responding with tariffs on their own. And suddenly, prices of things like cars, electronics, steel, and food go all the way up. And everyone starts arguing about who's winning and who's losing, or who's in the right and who's in the wrong. Okay, let's take a step back to Unit 1, where we learned why countries even trade in the first place. And we learned that countries trade because of specialization and comparative advantage. Instead of making everything themselves, countries focus on what they're relatively best at, and then they trade for the rest. That means there's lower costs, more choices, and higher total output for everyone involved. Now, if trade creates gains, why would governments ever want to interfere with it? And that's where tariffs come in. A tariff is just a tax on imports, goods that come from other countries. When a tariff is placed on imports, those goods become more expensive. And governments use tariffs for a few main reasons. First, it's to protect domestic industries. For example, if cheap foreign steel is hurting local steel producers, the tariff makes imported steel more expensive and gives domestic firms a better chance to compete. And secondly, it's to raise government revenue. Every imported unit now generates tax revenue for the government. And third, it's for political reasons, to pressure other countries during trade disputes. And this is what we often see during trade wars. One country raises tariffs and the other responds, and trade becomes more expensive on both sides. So while trade is about gains and efficiency, tariffs are about protection, revenue, and politics. And we'll see next, tariffs don't just affect countries. They directly change prices, quantity, surplus, and efficiency in the market. And let's see how that works in the graph. Okay, let's start with no tariffs. Here, there are no taxes on imports. Goods can move across borders freely without tax. And on this graph, notice how the world price is labeled PW and the world supply is labeled WS. And because the world price is lower than the domestic equilibrium price, consumers prefer buying from the global market. And at this lower world price, domestic producers supply only a small amount, shown at Q1, because they have no incentive to produce more because the price is so low. And consumers demand much more, and this is shown in Q2, because prices are low and they want to buy more. And that gap between Q1 and Q2 is filled by imports. And that's why you see that section labeled imported. Now, let's talk about who benefits. Here, consumers benefit a lot more. They got lower prices, more choices, and higher consumer surplus, which is the big blue area above the price line. And producers still earn some surplus, which is shown in the green, but it's smaller than before because they're competing with cheaper foreign goods. With no tariffs, total surplus is maximized, and there's no deadweight loss, no government distortion. And this is why economists generally say free trade creates gains overall. But now let's see what happens when a trade or a tariff is introduced. Okay, before the world price was PW set by the world supply. But once the government adds a tariff, foreign sellers now have to pay an extra cost to sell in our country. That means the world supply line shifts up from WS to WS plus tariff. And this new line represents the higher effective price of imports after the tax. As a result, the price in our country rises from PW to PT. At this higher price, domestic producers are willing to produce more, moving from Q1 to a higher level, and domestic consumers buy less, moving from Q2 inward. And the gap between production and consumption becomes smaller. Now, consumers lose surplus because prices are higher, and the blue area shrinks. And producers actually gain a surplus because they can sell more at a higher price. That green area grows. And the government gains a tariff revenue, which is shown by the yellow triangle in the middle. But here's the one downside. Some trades that used to benefit both buyers and sellers no longer happen. And that again is deadweight loss shown by the two red triangles. Now for a quiz or final exit ticket, fill this out just one more time. Okay, let's go through this quickly so you could go back to doing whatever you're doing. Before the tariff, the world price is 10, and at that price, domestic producers supply 10 units, while consumers demand 25 units. So the remaining 15 units are imported. And consumer surplus here is large, and producer surplus is much smaller. And there's no deadweight loss here because trade is fully efficient. But when the tariff is added, it raises the price from 10 to 12. And at this higher price, domestic producers increase production to 15 units, while consumers reduce quantity demanded all the way down to 20 units. Imports shrink from 15 units down to just 5 units. And because of the higher price, consumer surplus falls, while producer surplus increases since domestic firms sell at a higher price. The government now collects a tariff revenue equal to the tariff per unit multiplied by imports, which is just a rectangle on the graph. However, not all lost consumer surplus becomes gains for producers or the government. Some trades simply disappear, and the loss value is the deadweight loss shown by the two red triangles between supply and demand. And the triangles represent the reduction in total surplus caused by the tariff. Oh, finally, you made it all the way through. We've covered a lot this unit, but I feel like microeconomics gets a lot more interesting from Unit 3, so I'll see you there.